over a year now, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces have been at each other's throats. The fighting broke out in April last year. So what has been the effect of that fighting?
Yes, the effect has been plenty. So as you said, it started a bit over a year ago, and in the beginning the fighting started in the capital Khartoum, but then it quickly expanded. And today it reached many parts of Sudan, especially also it reached the west again, the western region Darfur, where we already saw a genocide in the early 2000s, where about 250,000 to 300,000 people died. And we can see a repetition of that now. There's mass killing going on. There's an ethnic cleansing of the so-called non-Arab ethnic groups, or which are considered to be non-Arab. But then, of course, also Khartoum, the capital, is sieged. Many other cities are under conflict. And yeah, it's pretty devastating today. We have about more than 10 million people that are displaced. So it makes it the biggest refugee crisis on this planet. And official numbers used to say there would be about 12,000 people dead, which we always knew was a heavy understatement, because we have actually no idea how many people died, because many areas, they're like out of touch. We don't have internet. They sometimes don't even have phone connection. So we don't know what exactly is happening. But now even the UN said that this must be probably factored by 10. And some experts have spoken of already about 200,000 people dead. And yes, so about 2/3 of the country's hospitals are out of service and out of work. They lack all kinds of supplies. People are dying not only within the conflicts, but they're dying of all kinds of diseases, whether it's malaria or diabetes or any other disease, because there's just no supplies anymore. There's a lack of oxygen, like even in areas where there's no fighting. And I think the worst of all is that Sudan is running rapidly towards a famine. So about 25 million people are threatened by hunger now. I think that's what the WFP said. And it's yeah, there's a lack of humanitarian aid. People are starving and people are dying of hunger even in the refugee camps. So yes, it's a pretty terrible situation.
And this is all in 1 year. This is incredible.
Yes, it's all been in the past year, and it's, as I said, probably if I think once the conflict is over, to be honest, I think if we really cover up all the things that are happening on the ground, which we don't know of yet, I think it will be a very negative surprise.
Look, could you briefly go through the revolutionary history of Sudan and also its counter-revolutionary history?
Yes. Well, Sudan has both a very long revolutionary history and a very long counter-revolutionary history. So since its independence in 1956, independence of the colonizers of British Egyptian rule, it had been in this, which Sudanese refer to as their vicious circle. It's been in the circle of revolution and the trying of establishing a democracy, and overthrown by a military coup d'etat, which then established military dictatorship, which then eventually was overthrown again by a revolution. So it had two primary revolutions, and then the recent revolution was in 2018-19, where a long-term dictator, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown by very peaceful popular uprisings, which continued to go out to the streets for peaceful protest for about 9 months, or like 6 months, until he stepped down, or he was forcefully stepped down. But then they continued to go out, and then they established a sit-in similar to what we knew from Gezi in Turkey or Tahrir Square. But this one lasted for 3 months, so it was quite powerful, and hundreds of thousands of people from all over the country came to Khartoum, and they stayed in the sit-in and established like a city within the city. So it was a very strong revolution, and it was a lot of people saw it differently from the revolutions before, and there was because it was so big and powerful, and because also this revolution didn't start in the capital, but it moved to the capital, but started more in the rural areas outskirts, which have been always neglected by the government. So then there was this revolution. There was a transitional government that was established in August 2019, which was made of a power sharing agreement between the military as a military council and the civilian powers, especially the Forces of Freedom and Change, the FFC. And Abdel Hamdouk became the president, and then this transitional government was supposed to to lead to elections, which never happened, because then in October 2021, the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, and the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, which is the military, together they staged a coup d'etat against the transitional government, and they took Prime Minister Abdel Hamdouk under house arrest and dissolved the government, which are the same parties that are now raging in this war. And it's especially also the same leaders. It's Abdel Fattah al-Burhan as the leader of the military, the SAF, and it's Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, which is also rightly called Hemeti, who is the leader of the RSF. So what happened was, back then they were combinedly pressuring as a counter-revolutionary act against the transitional government and against the revolution. But then the resistance was very strong. The revolutionary movement stayed, and especially the resistance committees, which were a primary outcome of this revolution, which also was like, they're considered to be the revolutionary institution. They are neighborhood-based local grassroots organizations, but they're about over 5,000 or 8,000 committees in the entire country. So they're very strong. They work within their communities, and they're very well connected, which made them very powerful, which also made their resistance to the coup very powerful. So many regard this war now as like the next step of the counter-revolution, because finally, even after a year and a half, these two, RSF and SAF, they were not able to establish their own government. They were not able to lead the country. They were not able to create dictatorship. What's happening now is that those two are fighting each other, but most likely the outcome, whoever wins, they're going to establish another dictatorship.
Just a question. Why is it that they are slaughtering so many people? Why aren't they just fighting each other?
Because they're fighting each other, but they're also fighting the civilians, because finally what they want is power. They want to stay in power, and they want to get it all. And the revolutionary movement has been, as I said, incredibly strong. And even until this war, even like the situation deteriorated greatly in Sudan. Like there was high inflation, there was already rising poverty, but people still remained, they still refused dictatorship. So the only way to really get power is to also kill civil society. It's to fragment the revolutionary movement. So what both parties are doing now in this war, despite fighting each other, where they're still combined, is attacking civilians, whether it's by the bombing of the SAF, or if it's the looting of houses and land grabbing by the RSF. And both are especially targeting members of the resistance movement. So there's been many reports of them abducting, killing, arresting members of the resistance committees. and people need to escape, people need to work underground. They're even now attacking their emergency response rooms, which are humanitarian aid organizations, which also come, that it's important for them mostly to say they're not the resistance committees because exactly they're being attacked, but they have their basis from the resistance committees, but they're basically civil society organizations that are providing first aid and humanitarian aid, which is lacking from the outside. So they're very important, but even those people are being attacked. So I think it's their only way to get back to power.
Good God. Are there any outside forces that are intervening in this, supporting either side? What's the interest? What's the involvement of any Western powers?
There are plenty of powers that I think are involved. Of course, because both warring parties have their own industrial complex, and the war economy is embedded in a much bigger economy. Both of them need to finance the war. So both of them have plenty of companies and sub-companies with whom they cooperate with other countries, they cooperate with other companies. So I would say that in the region, a very important power comes from the Gulf, especially the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, which we also know of as a great local counter-revolutionary power, which we already know in history. They had great force also into destroying the Arab revolutions that happened a decade ago. And now they're heavily funding the RSF, and we have a lot of proof for that. They're involved in gold mining. A lot of gold has always been extracted and given to the UAE, but there's also forms of militarized farming. It's a lot also about livestock. The Gulf doesn't have a lot of farming, so they tend to use other countries, especially from sub-Saharan Africa, where Ethiopia, it's also similar, where they get their livestock from. And so they're also fueling the war. It's the Gulf states in general, they have very little interest in Sudan establishing a democracy. And also there are also many other countries like Russia and the Africa Corps, formerly Wagner Group, the mercenaries, they have been active in Sudan for many, many years. And they've also always participated in extractivism. So all of these countries, they have no interest of the war to stop, because the extractivism is going on still, and it's going on better than ever before, because now there's no one to prove anything anymore. Yes, but also for the West, I think for the West, it's mainly abundance, I would say. There's very little effort, or not enough effort taken to really engage into negotiations, to engage into coming to ready to find peace. I would say that's for several reasons. One may be, as Cameron Hudson, he's a Sudan expert from the US, he once said there's kind of a Sudan fatigue going on, because Sudan has always been in this war and interwar state ever since its independence. So there's a bit of this feeling of like giving up on it. And so the revolution was like this last big hope, and there was a lot of investment also coming from the West. There was a big support for the transitional government, of course, also with like the interest of the respective nation states, but there was support. And now I think many are just, they don't see the change, they don't see hope anymore, so they just step back. I think that's one part. I think the second part is that geopolitically, especially for Europe, Sudan has mainly always been interested for them because it's an important focal point for migration routes. Because not only has Sudan always had a lot of refugees for themselves, but also it's exactly where people from Eastern Africa, but also from Sub-Saharan Africa, they take the route through Sudan, going to Libya, and then from Libya are starting their way through the Mediterranean. So, and we know about the Khartoum process and the EU, how they funded the RSF for many years. They actually legitimized the RSF as a legal or as a state executive power. So now that there's this war, the migration route is more or less off. People can no longer pass it so well. Still, the RSF is controlling the borders, or parts, maybe the military, but anyways, people don't get to pass so easily. And I mean, the EU very quickly proved their interest in, like, only weeks after the war, they brokered the first deal with Tunisia. And now in February, they had the second migration deal with El-Sisi in Egypt. So I think it's very clear that for them, as long as nobody crosses the Mediterranean, there's not much reason why they should intervene.
God. Yeah, Rosa Luxemburg said that we had the choice between socialism or barbarism, and what you've just described is barbarism. Now, the Sudanese Communist Party, in its May Day statement just a couple of weeks ago, warned that there was a real danger of this conflict widening into neighbouring countries. Why were they saying that?
So I think the problem is also, like, to start again in Sudan, is that the problem of retribalization and tribalism has grown, which of course I'm very critical of their terms because of their colonial heritage and their notion of, like, white supremacies as, like, tribes being some, like, this primitive construct. But still, I'm going to use them for now because we're literally lacking another way to say it. But I want to, again, make clear that when you talk about tribes, which is Gabila in Arabic, it's more a form of social stratification that is, of course, very complex, and it's bound to, like, a certain territory and a group that lives in this territory, and they share certain socioeconomic proximity, right? So it's of course very complex. And Sudan has many different tribes, which also, as a heritage of the colonial history, as we also know from many countries, has caused, like, a conflict, because then political identities were ethnicized, and which is now happening greatly in this war. And this, of course, can also be very dangerous to neighboring countries, because in this whole area, the state borders, they're not nation states, right? Their state borders are open, they're fluid, they're in flux. A lot of communities pass, they traverse. A lot of people have different relations, and they're the different ethnic groups. They live in different countries. So whatever happens in Sudan, especially now with this retribalization, as it's called, is that these political identities that are being reused to fuel the war, they could explode and expand anytime over the borders. For example, what we see in Darfur, Chad as a neighboring country, not only has Chad also always been in times of war and interwar and conflict, and it's very brittle, but also there were many interrelations on the Chad-Sudanese borderlands. So what's happening in Darfur really affects also Chad, and the situation could escalate anytime. But also, for example, if you look at South Sudan, which also has always had one form or the other of civil war going on, and we know that as well. Now the RSF started recruiting people from the borderlands, from different ethnic groups over there, so that causes further tension. They're also recruiting from the Sahel region, so like conflict spread generally. We know that, especially if it's about non-state actors, because they multiply and they also work in some kind of grassroots organization. So we know that already, but now that it's being more and more ethnicized and essentialized, it's going to become much more dangerous. Also, I already talked about the famine. Poverty and hunger also spread. and we right now, what we're doing as the West, we're leaving all the neighboring countries alone with these hundreds of millions of refugees, but hundreds of thousands in each respective region. We're leaving them alone. And the poverty also spreads and expands to their countries. And that also, of course, fuels the conflict. So the famine also in Sudan is not eventually going to stay in Sudan.
Wow. Okay, so we in the imperialist heartlands, what can anti-imperialists do? What demands can we raise that can make a difference here?
So I think first and foremost, the demand must be peace. And we should all demand of our governments to really engage in diplomatic efforts to really try to get to peace, and not the kind of peace as stability, as in terms of, well, whatever, it's a failed state, let people kill themselves there, but like a real peace that comes from the ground. So for that, it is necessary that we talk to the resistance committees, we listen to the resistance committees, we support the committees that are still existing and they're still trying to have their efforts, and also ask of our governments to listen to the committees and not just listen to some of the political elites, as it has always been part of the history in Sudanese politics and especially international interventions. So I think that is the most important. But then, of course, humanitarian aid. I just spoke briefly about the situation in the camps, but it's terrible. Even within us, talked about their hospitals, they need supplies, and it's basically forgotten. We need humanitarian corridors. We need really strong humanitarian aid, which is heavily underfunded, because I know there are many other conflicts also right now in this planet, but really Sudan is underfunded and underlooked in every single direction. So that would be the second part. And then, of course, the Geneva Convention, we need to establish escape routes. We need to help people to escape the country, and not just to the neighboring country, but really need to give them safe harbors in the countries that are actually safe, which are none of the neighboring countries. Mm-hmm. And we need to enable this and not block migration further. So I think as long as this is not done, nothing could come out of it. And then, of course, another thing that's really important, and I don't know how the situation is, especially in Australia, but what we do, especially as the West, is we need to call for a weapon embargo, and we need to stop sending weapons. And not only, of course, directly sending weapons to one of the warring parties, but we need to stop sending weapons also to the third countries, which may in turn send the weapons back to Sudan. And also drying them out financially and economically, which means drying out the industrial complex in which these two parties are embedded. That is very difficult, but there's been a lot of great investigation that has shown all the different complex interminglements and how these companies work. So again, then that doesn't mean only to cut business with these companies, but it also means cutting business and putting political pressure on all the other countries, namely, for example, the UAE, to stop doing business with them. Because if it's not, it's a globalized work. They work in like these capillary vessels. So if we don't work all jointly together, it's not going to work. It needs to really radically be dried out. And I don't think as long as we don't do this, it's just going to remain symbol politics. As long as we just have a conference here and a bit of humanitarian aid there, it's just greenwashing, but it's not actually helping. So I think these would be very important demands.
Right. Look, thank you very much, Saskia. It is truly heartbreaking that the revolutionary movement in Sudan has been faced with this effectively a genocide, because those revolutionary committees were so wonderful. But anyway, the struggle continues, and here in Australia, there's quite a number of Sudanese refugees that have been here for a long time, and Red Ant works with them, and we will continue to do so. Thank you very much for joining us and telling us everything that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.